After Germany lost in World War I, Adolf Hitler rose to power by spreading that the reason Germany lost the war was because of traitors from within. This was targeted at the German Jews, who by the way happened to have fought alongside Germany in this war. These hateful policies were adopted by Hitler's followers and was the basis on which stood the Nazi Party, which came to power in 1933. At the height of the spread of this propaganda, leaders of the Nazi Party alongside Hitler would rally thousands of fanatic followers in Nuremberg by promising them that the Third Reich would achieve its dominance over Europe. During World War II, the Nazis will indeed dominate Europe and inflict irreparable damage by eradicating Jews and any other race that they deemed inferior. And anyone who tried to stop this plan was considered an enemy. The war progressed, and the Allied forces started to have the upper hand. Discussions started emerging on how these war crimes and crimes against humanity will be addressed. In 1942, even before the war ended, leaders from the Allied forces met to discuss how they were going to stop the Nazis, and in the event the war ends in their favor, how they were going to bring all the Nazi leaders to face justice.
And we are determined that we will continue hand in hand. Whatever our suffering, whatever our toils, we will continue hand in hand like comrades and brothers until every vestige of the Nazi regime has been beaten into the ground.
As it became clear that the Allied forces were winning the war, bringing the Nazi war criminals to face justice for their crimes became a priority. Although, according to accounts, Hitler had committed suicide, there were still other high-profile Nazi leaders who could be brought to answer for what their party has done and be made an example of in front of the world. And what better place to do this other than Nuremberg, where the Nazis held countless rallies, spreading their lies and hatred. After the passing of Franklin Roosevelt, new President Harry Truman made this one a top priority for his office. The Allies had different ideas on how they wanted to punish the Nazis. The leader of the UK and the USSR, who had suffered tremendous losses at the hands of the Nazis, wanted the punishment to be harsh and wanted as many as 100,000 Nazis to be shot or killed with or without a trial. The Americans, however, insisted that a trial adhering to Western principles of justice should take place. In August 1945, the London Charter of International Military Tribunal was signed by the Allies, which would make way to the creation of the military court that would try the Nazis. Although at that time, in international law, there was no clear definition of what a war crime was. There were some people who highlighted this and accused the Allies of wanting to prosecute the Nazis for crimes that were not established in international law. And how about acts of aggressions committed by the Allied forces themselves? Who was going to hold them accountable for their acts? These questions nonetheless didn't stop the prosecution of the Nazis to proceed, with 4 charges brought against them. Number 1, conspiracy to wage aggressive war. Number 2, waging an aggressive war and crimes against peace. Number 3, war crimes, killing and torture of prisoners of war, enslavement and forced labor, bombing civilian populations and the use of outlawed weapons. Number 4, crimes against humanity. Although Nuremberg had not been badly damaged in the war, renovation work started immediately at the Palace of Justice, which was going to hold the trial of the century. 4 prosecutors, one from each of the Allied nations, were heading the IMT. President Truman chose Robert H. Jackson to represent the USA. Sir Hartley Shawcross represented Great Britain. François de Menthon represented France, but he will later be replaced by Auguste Champetier de Rips. And Roman Rudenko represented the Soviet Union. The court would indict 24 high-ranking Nazi officials, including Hermann Göring, second in command of the Nazi forces after Hitler. Of the 24, only 22 stood trial. One of the indicted officials was deemed too sick to stand trial, and another one committed suicide while he was in custody. The trial of Nuremberg started on November 20th, 1945, and it would last 10 months, ending on October 1st, 1946. During this time, the accused were held in cells inside the judicial building and had guards with them at all times. Even at night, lights were shined inside their rooms and guards stood outside their cells. This trial was publicized worldwide. Reporters from 28 different countries were present at the trial to cover the proceedings. All the Nazi defendants pleaded not guilty to the charges brought against them. But the judges relied on documentation made by the Germans themselves during the war that illustrated the atrocities that were committed. In one instance, Sir Hartley Shawcross, the British prosecutor, presented a statement written by a German construction worker. In it, he describes how 5,000 Jews were killed in a single day in a small town in Ukraine by a German SS unit. Other evidence and eyewitness accounts recounted the treatment of Jews in the concentration camps. Many of them were sent straight to their death in the gas chambers as they arrived to the camp on the trains. Others were subject to experiments by doctors at the camp. The evidence of violence, mistreatment, and torture was overwhelming. During a counter-examination, Rudolf Hess, who has been the commandant of Auschwitz concentration camp, admitted that sometimes more than 10,000 inmates would be killed at the camp in a single day. On September 31st, 1946, the court reconvened for the sentencing. Hermann Göring, along with 11 other defendants, were sentenced to death by hanging. He famously refused to accept the verdict, saying that this whole trial was a show of power by those who had won the war. One day before his execution, he committed suicide by taking a cyanide pill. Before his death, he wrote a letter where he didn't express any remorse, except the fact that he would have preferred to be executed by a firing squad. All other defendants who were sentenced to death were executed on the same day. The remaining defendants were given jail sentences ranging from life in prison to 15 years in prison, depending on their involvement in the war. These Nazi officials were criminals, there is no doubt about that. But the question remains whether the Nuremberg Trials were a fair show of justice. Many US Supreme Court justices raised concerns about these trials, stating that they were one-sided. The French, the Soviets also committed atrocities during the war, for which they have never answered. But for more of humanity history, victors will always make the rules.